Have you ever noticed how some people can walk away from love and still act like they don't care? Like they can lose someone important, stay silent for days, even weeks, and seem completely fine on the outside. No panic, no chasing, no emotional breakdown, just distance, calm, controlled, almost too controlled. But here's the real question. Is that really peace, or is it something else? Because there is a hidden psychological pattern that most people never recognize in themselves, a pattern that looks like strength but slowly destroys emotional connection from the inside out. It doesn't happen in one moment. It doesn't feel like a big decision. It happens quietly, almost invisibly, and by the time a person realizes it, they are already emotionally far from the life they actually wanted. This is what can be called the avoidant death pattern. Not a physical death, but the slow death of emotional closeness, the death of vulnerability, the death of real connection. At first, it feels safe. That's the most dangerous part. The mind learns a simple rule. If closeness has ever caused pain, then distance must equal safety. So, instead of facing emotional discomfort, the brain starts building a silent strategy. Stay independent. Don't need anyone. Don't rely too much. Don't open up too deeply. And slowly, this doesn't feel like a strategy anymore. It becomes identity. I'm just someone who likes space. I'm better alone. I don't really need people that much. And the mind believes it completely. But psychology shows something deeper is happening underneath. Avoidance is not actually emotional strength. It is emotional protection. It is the nervous system trying to avoid the risk of being hurt again. And while protection feels safe in the short term, it always comes with a hidden cost in the long term. Because what you protect yourself from, you also disconnect from. And this is where the pattern begins to form. At first, it is small things. Not replying immediately, not expressing feelings fully, holding back emotions in conversations, keeping relationships at a comfortable distance, not too close, not too deep, just enough to stay safe. But over time, something shifts internally. Emotional expression starts to feel unnatural. Vulnerability starts to feel uncomfortable. Even simple emotional honesty begins to feel like exposure. And without noticing it, a wall is being built, not a visible wall, a psychological one, a wall between you and intimacy, a wall between you and emotional dependence, a wall between you and being fully seen. And here is the part most people never expect. That wall doesn't just block pain, it also blocks joy. Because the same openness that allows love is the same openness that allows emotional depth. When you shut down one side, you don't just reduce suffering, you reduce feeling altogether. Life becomes quieter, but also flatter, less painful, but also less alive. This is why many avoidant people don't feel bad at first. They feel neutral, controlled, functional, but over time, neutrality turns into emotional numbness. Conversations feel less meaningful, relationships feel less exciting, even achievements feel less satisfying. Everything starts to feel like it's happening at a distance. And yet, from the outside, nothing looks wrong. That is what makes this pattern so powerful and so dangerous. Because when pain is not visible, it is easy to believe nothing needs to change. The mind says, I'm fine. The lifestyle looks stable. There is no chaos, no drama, no emotional intensity. But inside, something essential is slowly shutting down. The ability to feel deeply connected. And once that begins to fade, relationships don't feel like connection anymore. They feel like responsibility, or pressure, or something to manage instead of something to experience. So the instinct becomes even stronger. Pull back more, stay safer, stay detached. And the cycle reinforces itself. This is the avoidant death pattern at its earliest stage. Not dramatic, not obvious, just a slow emotional distancing from anything that requires openness. And the scariest part is that it often feels like maturity, like control, like emotional intelligence. But real emotional strength is not distance from feelings. It is the ability to stay present with them without running away. And if you've ever wondered why some people feel deeply lonely even when they are surrounded by others, or why some relationships collapse without clear reasons, or why someone can say, I don't care, but still feel it deeply inside, then what comes next will start to make things much clearer. Because understanding this pattern is not just about awareness, it is about seeing what most people never connect in time. And by the end of this, you'll understand not only how this pattern forms, but also how it quietly shapes decisions, relationships, and identity itself. And most importantly, how it can actually be broken before it takes more from you than it already has. What looks like calm behavior on the surface is often misunderstood as emotional maturity. People see someone pulling away, staying quiet during conflict, not reacting strongly, and they assume that person is stable, strong, and self-sufficient. But psychology tells a very different story when we look beneath the surface. What is actually happening is not strength in the way most people define it. It is the mind learning how to reduce emotional pressure by limiting exposure to anything that feels unpredictable. When someone has experienced emotional discomfort in the past, especially in close relationships, the brain starts to create shortcuts. These shortcuts are not logical decisions. They are survival responses shaped by experience. The human nervous system is built to protect. It remembers emotional pain in a similar way it remembers physical danger. So when closeness once led to rejection, criticism, abandonment, or overwhelming emotional stress, the body does not forget that pattern. Even if the current situation is safe, the internal system reacts as if the risk still exists. This is where the shift begins. Instead of moving toward connection, the person starts moving away from emotional intensity, not because they consciously choose to reject others, but because their internal system associates closeness with loss of control, and control becomes the priority. At this stage, avoidance is not yet a personality trait. It is a coping mechanism. A very simple one. If something feels emotionally heavy, reduce engagement. If a conversation becomes too deep, redirect it. If someone becomes too important, create distance to restore internal balance. It feels like relief in the moment, and the brain learns quickly from relief. This is how reinforcement works. The mind repeats what temporarily reduces discomfort. Each time emotional space is created, tension decreases. That reduction in tension is interpreted as success, so the behavior gets stronger. Not because it is correct, but because it works in the short term. Over time, this pattern becomes automatic. There is less thinking involved. It becomes a reflex. Emotional situations start triggering a subtle internal alarm. Not loud, not obvious, just enough to create discomfort. And the response becomes predictable. Step back, delay, disconnect, or emotionally minimize the situation. What is important to understand is that this is not coldness. It is sensitivity that has been trained to protect itself. Many people misjudge this pattern from the outside. They assume the person simply does not care enough. But internally, caring is often exactly what creates the discomfort, because caring increases emotional stakes, and higher emotional stakes increase the perceived risk of being hurt. So a conflict forms inside the mind. One part wants connection. Another part wants safety, and safety usually wins, not because it is better, but because it feels more urgent in the nervous system. This internal conflict creates inconsistency in relationships. There can be moments of closeness followed by sudden withdrawal, moments of openness followed by emotional shutdown. To others, it feels confusing. To the person experiencing it, it feels like regulation, like restoring balance after emotional overload. But there is a hidden consequence that builds slowly over time. Every time emotional engagement is reduced, the capacity for emotional tolerance also decreases. In simple terms, the less someone stays present with emotional intensity, the more intense it starts to feel in the future. This is why the pattern strengthens itself. Avoidance does not just respond to discomfort, it increases sensitivity to discomfort. So what once felt manageable begins to feel overwhelming more quickly. This creates a loop where the threshold for emotional safety keeps shrinking. At the same time, identity begins to form around this behavior. The person starts believing certain statements about themselves. I am not good with emotions. I prefer space. I function better alone. These statements feel like self-awareness, but they are often explanations created after the pattern has already formed. The mind prefers explanations that reduce internal conflict. If behavior cannot be changed immediately, it gets justified. And once justified, it becomes harder to question. There's also another layer that is rarely noticed. Emotional detachment does not remove the need for connection. It only reduces visible dependence on it. The need itself remains active in the background. This is why many people with strong avoidance patterns still experience loneliness, even when they appear socially independent. But instead of moving toward connection, they often move toward substitutes for connection. Distraction, productivity, constant thinking, controlled environments, anything that reduces emotional unpredictability. These substitutes create structure, but they do not create fulfillment. The result is a life that feels manageable but not deeply satisfying, stable but not fully alive, predictable but emotionally limited. And the most subtle part of this entire process is that it feels reasonable at every step. Nothing appears extreme. There is no obvious breakdown, no dramatic turning point, just small logical decisions repeated over time, each one making sense on its own, each one slightly reducing emotional exposure. That is why this pattern is so difficult to recognize while it is happening. It does not look like avoidance from the inside. It looks like decision making. It looks like preference. It looks like personality. But underneath those explanations, the same mechanism continues operating, a system designed to protect emotional safety by limiting emotional depth. And while protection is necessary in life, overprotection has a cost, because anything that reduces risk too much also reduces experience. And emotional experience is what gives relationships meaning, depth, and fulfillment. Understanding this is not about judgment, it is about clarity, because once the mechanism becomes visible, it stops operating purely in the background, and what becomes visible can eventually be changed. When emotional withdrawal continues for a long enough time, something deeper begins to change inside the human experience. It is not just behavior anymore, it becomes perception. The way situations are interpreted, the way people are understood, and even the way personal needs are felt, all start to shift in a quiet but powerful direction. At this stage, emotional distance is no longer only a reaction to discomfort. It becomes the default setting. Instead of stepping back only during intense moments, the mind begins to anticipate intensity before it even arrives. This anticipation shapes decisions early, often before real emotional contact has fully developed. A conversation that could have grown naturally is stopped early. A relationship that could have deepened is kept at a surface level. An opportunity for closeness is softened, delayed, or redirected, not because of clear danger, but because of expected discomfort. The brain starts acting on prediction rather than reality. This is where emotional forecasting takes control. The mind begins to simulate possible outcomes and treat them as if they are already happening. Small signs are overinterpreted. Silence is read as pressure. Expectations are assumed even when they are not expressed. And because of these interpretations, emotional safety feels constantly at risk. What makes this phase powerful is that it feels rational. The mind provides reasons for each step. It creates explanations that sound logical and protective. It is better to stay distant. It is safer not to invest too much. Things usually end the same way anyway. These thoughts do not feel like fear. They feel like wisdom gained from experience. But underneath these thoughts, there is a narrowing of emotional space. The range of what feels safe to engage with becomes smaller. Situations that once felt normal begin to feel slightly overwhelming. And what was once meaningful connection starts to feel like pressure that must be managed carefully. At the same time, emotional expression becomes less spontaneous. Feelings are no longer shared in real time. They are processed internally, filtered, and often reduced before being communicated. This creates a gap between inner experience and outward behavior. On the outside, everything appears controlled. On the inside, emotions are still present, but they are no longer fully expressed. Over time, this gap creates internal tension. The person becomes skilled at presenting calmness while managing complexity internally. But this split requires energy. An emotional energy that is used for constant self-regulation is no longer available for connection, creativity, or openness. Another important shift happens in how trust is formed. Instead of building trust gradually through experience, the mind starts waiting for proof of safety before allowing closeness. But because emotional distance limits shared experience, that proof is rarely fully formed. So trust remains incomplete and relationships stay in a paused state. This creates a cycle that quietly maintains itself. Limited openness leads to limited connection. Limited connection leads to limited trust. Limited trust reinforces the decision to stay distant. Each part feeds the next without needing conscious effort. Inside this cycle, emotional needs do not disappear. They become less visible, even to the person experiencing them. Needs for support, understanding, and closeness are still present, but they are often minimized or ignored. Over time, the mind adapts by reducing awareness of those needs to avoid internal conflict. This is where emotional suppression becomes more subtle. It is not about forcefully shutting down feelings. It is about slowly lowering their importance in daily life. Emotional signals are still received, but they are not prioritized. They are postponed, redirected, or rationalized away. As this continues, personal identity begins to adjust. The individual starts seeing themselves through the lens of independence. Being self-reliant becomes not just a behavior, but a defining characteristic. Asking for support starts to feel unnatural. Relying on others starts to feel unnecessary or even risky. However, underneath this identity, there is often a hidden contradiction. Moments of emotional intensity can still create strong internal responses. Situations involving loss, rejection, or deep connection can still activate vulnerability, but instead of being processed through openness, they are handled through withdrawal or internal containment. This contradiction creates confusion in relationships. Others may experience inconsistency. At times there is engagement and warmth. At other times there is distance and silence. The pattern is not intentional inconsistency. It is a shifting between openness and protection depending on internal emotional load. What is rarely seen from the outside is the effort required to maintain this control. Emotional regulation at this level is not passive. It requires constant internal monitoring. Checking responses, limiting expression, managing proximity, and adjusting behavior to maintain a sense of safety. Because of this ongoing internal effort, emotional exhaustion can develop without clear external cause. Life may look stable, but internally there is continuous regulation happening in the background. This can lead to a feeling of being drained without understanding exactly why. Another effect appears in how relationships are experienced over time. Instead of being a source of emotional nourishment, they can begin to feel like systems that require careful management. The focus shifts from experiencing connection to maintaining balance, from openness to control, from feeling to monitoring. And when emotional life becomes something to manage rather than live through, satisfaction naturally decreases. Not because nothing good is present, but because the depth of experience is limited by constant protection. This stage is important because it shows how deeply a pattern can integrate into daily life without dramatic signs. There is no obvious collapse, no clear moment of change, just a gradual reshaping of emotional engagement until distance feels normal and closeness feels uncertain. Understanding this level of the pattern is essential because it reveals that avoidance is not only about relationships, it becomes a way of organizing emotional reality itself. And once emotional reality is organized around protection, breaking that structure requires more than awareness. It requires a shift in how safety, connection, and presence are understood internally. At a certain point in this emotional pattern, something very subtle but powerful begins to happen. The person stops reacting only to real experiences and starts reacting to imagined emotional outcomes. The present moment becomes less important than what the mind predicts could happen next. This shift changes everything because life is no longer experienced directly. It is filtered through expectation. Instead of responding to what is actually being said or done, the internal system begins scanning for hidden meaning. Small pauses in conversation feel significant. Neutral expressions feel uncertain. Simple interactions are analyzed for emotional risk. This creates a mental environment where nothing is fully relaxed, even when nothing is wrong. The mind does this as a form of protection. It tries to stay ahead of emotional discomfort by predicting it early, but in doing so, it increases sensitivity. The nervous system becomes trained to detect possible emotional threat in ordinary situations. Over time, this leads to a constant background tension that is difficult to notice but always present. What makes this stage complex is that it does not feel like fear in the traditional sense. It feels like careful thinking, like awareness, like being observant. But underneath that awareness is a system that is always preparing to step away if emotional intensity rises beyond a certain point. This creates a unique type of emotional distance. The person may still participate in relationships, conversations, and commitments, but a part of their attention is always reserved for exit planning. Not in a conscious way, but as a quiet readiness to disengage if needed. This prevents full immersion in any experience. Because of this partial engagement, emotional experiences become less impactful. Joy is felt, but not fully absorbed. Connection is experienced, but not deeply surrendered to. Even positive moments carry a subtle limitation, as if the mind is holding back a portion of itself at all times. Over time, this affects memory and emotional imprinting. Events that should feel meaningful may not leave a strong internal mark. The experience happens, but the emotional weight is reduced. This contributes to a sense that life is passing without deep emotional anchoring. Another important development in this phase is the increasing reliance on self-contained emotional regulation. Instead of processing feelings through interaction, reflection becomes internalized. The person learns to handle everything within their own mind. On the surface, this appears highly independent, but internally, it reduces emotional exchange. This self-contained system starts to feel efficient. There is no need to explain, no need to depend, no need to expose inner states. Everything is managed internally. However, emotional processing without external reflection often lacks balance. It can become circular, reinforcing existing interpretations without challenge or correction. As this continues, emotional conclusions become more fixed. The mind develops strong internal narratives about relationships, trust, and vulnerability. These narratives feel like conclusions based on experience, but they are often shaped by repeated emotional protection rather than full emotional engagement. This is where emotional rigidity begins to form, not in behavior alone, but in interpretation. The way situations are understood becomes less flexible. New experiences are filtered through old emotional frameworks, even when the present context is different. At the same time, emotional expectations of others begin to lower. Instead of expecting connection to grow, the mind prepares for distance to return. This expectation subtly influences behavior. If distance is expected, openness decreases. If openness decreases, connection becomes harder to build. The expectation becomes self-reinforcing. There is also a growing difficulty in receiving emotional support. When support is offered, it may feel uncomfortable or unfamiliar, not because it is unwanted, but because it disrupts the internal system of self-reliance. Accepting support introduces emotional dependence, even in small forms, and that can trigger internal resistance. This resistance is often misunderstood. It is not rejection of care. It is discomfort with vulnerability. The nervous system interprets receiving support as lowering protection, even when the situation is safe. So the instinct is to minimize, decline, or emotionally distance from it. As this pattern deepens, relationships may begin to feel predictable in a limiting way. Instead of evolving naturally, they follow familiar emotional cycles. Distance appears when things become close. Stability appears when distance is restored. This repetition creates a quiet sense of emotional repetition in life experiences. What is important here is that the person does not feel trapped intentionally. The system feels normal because it has been repeated for a long time. The emotional range that once existed gradually becomes less accessible, not through force, but through consistent limitation of exposure. This is also the stage where emotional awareness can become misleading. Because the person is highly aware of their internal state, they may assume they are emotionally in control. But awareness alone does not equal openness. It can also become a tool for observation without participation. So emotions are understood intellectually rather than experienced fully. They are identified, named, and analyzed, but not always felt in a raw or unfiltered way. This creates a separation between understanding emotions and living them. And when emotional life becomes more conceptual than experiential, connection loses its natural depth. Relationships may still function, but they often lack emotional immersion. There is structure, communication, and awareness, but less surrender to the moment. This entire stage shows how protection can evolve into a refined system that operates quietly in the background of daily life. It does not need dramatic behavior to exist. It survives through subtle habits of thought, interpretation, and emotional filtering. Recognizing this level of the pattern is important because it reveals that emotional avoidance is not just about staying away from people. It is about how reality itself is internally organized. And when reality is organized around prediction, control, and emotional filtering, the ability to experience life directly becomes limited in ways that are not immediately obvious, but deeply influential over time.